It is August 1854, and London is baking under a merciless sun. The air in the district of Soho is thick, yellow, and heavy, with the stench of open cesspools, horse manure, and rotting refuse. To the Victorian mind, this smell is not just disgusting, it is deadly. They call it miasma, believing that the foul air itself carries the plague. But they are wrong. The killer isn't in the air they breathe, it is in the water they drink. This is the story of the Blue Death, cholera. It is a biological predator so efficient that a man can wake up healthy at sunrise and be a dehydrated corpse by sunset, his skin turning a ghostly blue. While the city prays for fresh air, one man, a quiet, socially awkward doctor named John Snow, is looking down at the ground, tracing a map of the dead to find a handle that, once turned, will save the world. Chapter 1. The Kingdom of Night Soil. To understand the catastrophe of 1854, we must first look at the anatomy of the city itself. By the mid-19th century, London had mutated into a technological monster that it could no longer control. It was the wealthiest city in human history, the capital of an empire upon which the sun never set. Yet physically, it was drowning in its own filth. The population had exploded to 2.5 million people. But the city's sanitation system was still stuck in the Middle Ages. For centuries, Londoners had deposited their waste into cesspools, deep, brick-lined pits dug into the basements of their own homes. When these pits filled up, night soil men would come under the cover of darkness to empty them. But with the population boom, the sheer volume of human waste overwhelmed the system. The pits overflowed. The basements of London became swamps of excrement, seeping into the foundations, the soil, and, crucially, the groundwater. Then came a technological innovation that was supposed to save them, but instead, it sealed their doom. The flush toilet. The water closet became a status symbol for the Victorian middle class. It washed the waste away, out of sight and out of mind. But where did it go? The existing cesspools couldn't handle the sudden influx of gallons of water used to flush the toilets. They cracked, leaked, and spilled over. To solve this, the authorities made a fatal decision. They encouraged connecting household drains to the street sewers. But the sewers were originally designed only for rainwater runoff, and these sewers emptied directly into the River Thames. This created a tragic paradox driven by the scientific ignorance of the era. The prevailing dogma of the time was the miasma theory. The medical elite, and indeed the general public, believed that disease was caused by bad air, vapors rising from rotting matter. This made intuitive sense to the Victorian mind. The poor neighborhoods smelled terrible, and that was where people died. If the smell was the killer, then the solution was to remove the source of the smell. Consequently, the Board of Health, acting with the best intentions of public hygiene, ordered the cesspools to be flushed out into the river to clean the air of the city. In doing so, they took the concentrated viral waste of 2 million people and dumped it directly into the city's primary source of drinking water. They had essentially turned the Thames into the largest open sewer in the world, and then dipped their cups into it. Into this toxic cocktail entered a microscopic assassin, Vibrio cholera. This ancient bacteria is an aquatic organism that thrives in brackish water, but it found a paradise in the warm, nutrient-rich filth of the Thames. Once swallowed, the bacteria does not eat the host. It tricks the host. It passes through the stomach acid and latches onto the lining of the small intestine. There, it releases a toxin that disrupts the cellular mechanism that balances water. It effectively reverses the flow. Instead of absorbing water, the cells begin to dump every drop of fluid the body possesses back into the gut. The result is catastrophic dehydration. The victim doesn't just lose water, their blood thickens into a tar-like sludge, their organs shut down, and they turn blue as their circulation fails. By flushing their waste into the river to escape the bad air, London had inadvertently created the perfect delivery system for a waterborne massacre.
Chapter 2.
The Men Who Put People to Sleep. In the midst of this chaotic city, there lived a man who was the antithesis of the typical Victorian gentleman. Dr. John Snow was not a loud, charismatic orator like the politicians in Westminster, nor was he a wealthy aristocrat. He was a vegetarian, a teetotaler, and a man of intense, almost peculiar quietness. Born to a working-class family, he had clawed his way up through the rigid British class system solely on the power of his intellect. But before he became the hunter of cholera, he was known as the master of oblivion. John Snow was England's leading anesthetist. At a time when surgery was a brutal, screaming agony, Snow was pioneering the precise use of ether and chloroform to put patients into a painless sleep. He was so respected in this dangerous new field that he was eventually trusted to administer chloroform to Queen Victoria herself during childbirth. This background in gases is the key to understanding his breakthrough. Because Snow spent his days measuring the diffusion of invisible vapors, he understood exactly how gases behaved. He knew that if you released a gas into a room, it diluted the further it traveled from the source. He also knew that if a man inhaled a poisonous gas, the damage would appear in his lungs and his blood. But when Snow looked at cholera patients, he saw something that contradicted the miasma theory entirely. The symptoms of cholera were not respiratory. The victims did not cough. They did not gasp for air until the very end. The devastation was entirely focused on the alimentary canal, the stomach, and the intestines. The disease began with violent vomiting and diarrhea. To Snow's logical mind, this was a smoking gun. A poison inhaled from the air would not bypass the lungs and selectively attack the gut. The agent of death had to be something that was eaten or drunk. Snow had seen this grim reality firsthand years earlier, in 1832, when he was just an apprentice doctor treating coal miners during an earlier outbreak. He noticed that miners, who ate with dirty hands deep underground, where there were no toilets, were dying in droves. There was no bad air specific to the mines that didn't exist elsewhere, but there was plenty of fecal matter sharing space with their food. In 1849, he published a pamphlet titled On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, arguing that the disease was caused by a specific invisible organic material. He didn't have the word bacteria yet, so he called it a poison that could multiply, which was transmitted through water contaminated by the waste of the sick. It was a brilliant, revolutionary deduction, and it was completely ignored. The medical establishment, led by the prestigious journal The Lancet and the Board of Health, scoffed at him. The idea that people were eating their own waste was too disgusting to contemplate, and the concept of waterborne, invisible killers was too abstract compared to the pungent, obvious smell of the slums. They dismissed Snow's theory as a quirky obsession. To the elites, the smell was the disease. They argued that the poor died because they were dirty and lived in stinking hovels, framing the epidemic as a moral failure rather than a biological one. Snow stood alone, armed only with his logic and his unpopular theory, waiting for the tragic opportunity to prove them wrong. That opportunity would arrive on a hot night in late August, when a baby living at 40 Broad Street fell ill and her mother washed a diaper into a cesspool just a few feet from the neighborhood pump. Chapter 3. The Broad Street Explosion. The catastrophe did not begin with a bang, but with a deceptive silence in the basement of 40 Broad Street, where the infant known as Baby Lewis had fallen ill. But what followed on the night of August 31st, 1854, was a biological detonation. Within hours of the sun setting, the neighborhood of Soho transformed into a morgue. It was as if a medieval plague had suddenly materialized in the heart of the modern industrial age. Over the next 3 days, 127 people living in or around Broad Street died. By the following week, 3/4 of the residents had fled, leaving their homes unlocked and their meals unfinished on the tables. The streets, usually bustling with vendors and carts, fell into a terrified silence, broken only by the rumble of hearses and the cries of the dying echoing from open windows. To witness a death by cholera is to witness the human body turning against itself with terrifying violence. The onset was sudden and merciless. A man could be sharing a pint at the local pub, feeling perfectly fine, and suddenly be struck by a wave of abdominal cramping so severe it brought him to his knees. Then came the purging. The victim's body began to expel water at an impossible rate, producing the infamous rice water stool, a white, odorless liquid that was essentially the stripped lining of the intestines. This was not merely uncomfortable, it was lethal. A healthy adult could lose liters of fluid in a matter of hours. As the water drained away, the blood turned viscous and thick like tar, unable to circulate oxygen to the extremities. The capillaries collapsed. The skin lost all elasticity. If you pinched it, it wouldn't snap back, but stayed molded like clay. Then came the symptom that gave the disease its name: the Blue Death. Deprived of oxygen, the lips, fingernails, and finally the entire skin tone of the victim turned a ghastly shade of slate blue or violet. The face shrank, the eyes sunk deep into the sockets, and the voice was reduced to a husky, barely audible whisper due to the extreme dryness of the vocal cords. It was a death of utter exhaustion, where the mind often remained horrifyingly clear until the heart simply stopped beating because the blood was too thick to pump. Into this valley of the shadow of death walked John Snow. While the rest of London was packing their bags and fleeing the miasma of Soho, Snow walked directly toward the epicenter. He was not armed with a mask to filter the air, for he knew the air was innocent. He was armed with a notebook. He needed data. He visited the homes where entire families lay dead in the same bed. He interviewed the terrified survivors, asking not about what they had smelled, but about what they had drunk. His investigation led him again and again to the intersection of Broad Street and Cambridge Street, where a popular water pump stood. It was renowned for its cool, sparkling, carbonated taste. Snow drew a sample of the water. To the naked eye, it was clear. To the nose, it was odorless. It looked like the purest water in London. But Snow knew that clarity was a lie. He suspected that this pump was the mouth of the volcano, spewing death into the cups of the neighborhood. And he had to prove it before the entire parish was wiped off the map. Chapter 4. The Ghost Map. The Anomalies. John Snow returned to his study, not with a cure, but with a list of addresses. But a list was just raw data. To convince the skeptical authorities, he needed a narrative they could see. He took a map of the Soho district and began to mark the location of every death he had investigated. For every fatality, he drew a thick black bar perpendicular to the street address. As the bars accumulated, a chilling pattern began to emerge from the ink. It was not a random scattershot, nor was it a cloud spreading with the wind. It was a radial burst, a blast zone centered on a single geographic point, the water pump at Broad Street. This visual document, which would later become known as the Ghost Map, was arguably the most important infographic in the history of medicine. It essentially created a Voronoi diagram, a mathematical partition of a plane, showing that the victims were all clustered within the walking distance of that specific pump. If you lived closer to another pump, you lived. If the Broad Street pump was your nearest source, you died. But Snow knew that a cluster alone wasn't enough. The miasma advocates would simply argue that the bad air was just concentrated in that specific spot. To prove his waterborne theory, Snow had to act like a detective looking for alibis. He needed to explain the anomalies, the people who should have died but didn't, and the people who shouldn't have died but did. This led him to the Lion Brewery on Broad Street. It was situated right in the heart of the hot zone, surrounded by death. Yet, of the 70 workers employed there, not a single one had perished. When Snow interviewed the foreman, he discovered the life-saving reason. The workers were given a daily allowance of malt liquor. They drank beer, not water. And if they did need water, the brewery had its own private well. The alcohol in the beer and the boiling process had unwittingly saved them, providing a control group right in the middle of the epidemic. If the bad air theory were true, these men, breathing the same air as their dying neighbors, should have been the first to fall. Then there was the Poland Street Workhouse, a grim institution housing over 500 of the city's most destitute people. It was surrounded on 3 sides by houses decimated by cholera. By all logic of the miasma theory, this crowded, filthy building should have been a mass grave. Yet, only 5 inmates died. Why? Snow found that the workhouse, like the brewery, had its own private well. The bad air could not penetrate the plumbing. But the final, undeniable piece of evidence, the smoking gun, came from miles away in the clean, airy district of Hampstead. A widow named Susanna Ely, who had not set foot in Soho for months, suddenly died of cholera. Her niece, who visited her, also died. The authorities were baffled. There was no cholera in Hampstead. Snow tracked down the widow's son and discovered a bizarre habit. Susanna Ely had once lived in Soho and loved the taste of the Broad Street water so much that she paid a cart to deliver a jug of it to her Hampstead home every day. The last bottle had arrived on August 31st. She had literally imported her death. With this tragic confirmation, Snow had tracked the killer across the city. It wasn't the wind, it was the water in the jug. Chapter 5. The Handle. The Cesspool. On the evening of September 7, 1854, John Snow stood before the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish. He was an outsider to local politics, a quiet man, standing in a room full of frightened, exhausted officials who had watched their community crumble. He did not offer them a magical cure or a complex medical theory filled with Latin jargon. Instead, he placed his map on the table and offered a simple, mechanical solution. Remove the handle from the Broad Street pump. The board was incredulous. To them, the Broad Street water was the pride of the neighborhood, cool, effervescent, and seemingly purer than the murky water of the Thames. But the visual evidence of Snow's map, the radioblast zone of death centered on that single iron spout, was too stark to ignore. Desperate to be seen doing something, they agreed. The following morning, a workman arrived with a simple set of tools and detached the iron handle from the pump body. It was an unceremonious act, a small gesture of municipal maintenance, yet it marked a pivotal moment in the history of human survival. The pump was silenced. Almost immediately, the neighborhood, which was already emptying out, saw the cases of cholera plummet. The explosion was over, but stopping the outbreak was not enough. Snow needed to understand the mechanics of the crime. The removal of the handle was the arrest. Now he needed the motive and the weapon. In the weeks that followed, Snow was joined by an unlikely ally, the Reverend Henry Whitehead. Whitehead was a local curate who administered to the dying and initially believed the miasma theory. But Snow's data converted him. Together, they ordered the excavation of the ground beneath the pump to see what lay in the darkness below the cobblestones. What they exposed was a diagram of architectural negligence that horrified the surveyors. The well of the pump descended 28 feet into the earth. Just a few feet away, less than 3 feet, in fact, separated by nothing but crumbling brick and damp dirt, was the cesspool of the house at 40 Broad Street. The brickwork of the cesspool was rotten, effectively turning the soil between the two pits into a sieve. For weeks, the raw sewage from the house had been percolating silently through the earth and dripping directly into the community's drinking water well. This revelation connected the final dot back to patient zero. The infant, baby Lewis, who lived at 40 Broad Street, had suffered from severe diarrhea days before the major outbreak began. Her mother had soaked the soiled diapers in pails of water and emptied them into that leaking cesspool. That specific viral load had seeped into the well, transforming the public water source into a biological weapon. The tragic irony was complete. The residents of Soho had rejected the piped water from the river because it looked dirty, preferring the pump water because it looked clear and tasted refreshing. Snow's analysis revealed that the cool temperature and the carbonated bubbles that the residents loved so much were not signs of purity. They were the chemical byproducts of decaying organic matter and sewer gas. They had not just been drinking water. They had been drinking the liquefied essence of the first victim, deceived by the clarity of the poison in their cups. We often expect history to reward its heroes instantly, but John Snow received no such glory. Once the panic subsided, the Board of Health quietly replaced the handle on the Broad Street pump, rejecting Snow's unpleasant waterborne theory in favor of the familiar Miasma Doctrine. Snow died of a stroke just 4 years later, at the age of 45, never seeing his work fully vindicated. It would take the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell of the Thames became so overpowering that it physically shut down Parliament, for London to finally construct the massive sewer system that saved the city. Yet Snow's legacy is far greater than a single pump. By tracing the ghost map, he proved that disease was not a divine punishment or a mysterious fog, but a logical problem solvable with data. He replaced superstition with statistics. Today, whenever a scientist tracks a viral outbreak on a screen, they are walking in the footsteps of the quiet doctor who dared to look past the smell and find the truth in the water. John Snow didn't just save Soho. He taught the world how to survive itself.